It's a great pleasure to be here and to revisit Carleton, and I'll get on to the paper. Basically, I think you're guinea pigs, because this is the first opportunity I've really had to air the ideas in this paper, and the ideas come out of recently finishing a book. The book's called The Signature of Power. It does deal with the advertised title, Governmentality and Economic Theology. But it presents me with a few challenges, I think. One is to make it relevant to the occasion. And the occasion is connected to the theme of security in publics, the workshop tomorrow. But another thing is to condense a book into a talk. So when I wrote the book, I tried to write it in a way that had a lot of narrative in it, and that wasn't terribly immediately theoretical, or at least was leavened by the narrative, if you like. One of the problems, I guess, in trying to condense a book, is that it sounds much more like a coherent theory than it actually is, and much less like the kind of narrative structure that I tried to give it. But the book's, as the title suggests, Signature of Power, is about power, and I fear that that's an unfashionable concept in humanities and social sciences generally, that it's fallen out of favour in terms of a whole series of other kinds of concepts: government, governance, assemblages, networks, systems, and so on. So that's one. So my central contention is that we need to rethink the concept of power. And that might not strike you as urgent as I think it is. And the second thought I have is that the second challenge is that this is theoretical, but I guess that given that you've responded to the title and you've turned out on a Thursday night, that might not be as much of a challenge as I thought. Anyway, I think what I'm doing is actually quite practical. It might not sound practical in the first instance, in that I would place it within the idea of an analytics of power, as Foucault talked about, and I'm really trying to renovate or extend that project. So it actually has a kind of, I think, practical payoff. But anyway, let me start with one of the very small narratives. And while reading Giorgio Agamben's recent book, which I'm going to talk about a bit, The Kingdom and the Glory, I found a reference to Marcel Mauss's unfinished dissertation on prayer. For Agamben, Mauss's work is one of a complex chain of references by which he establishes a relationship between sovereignty and glory, and comes to argue that sovereignty is at its centre a kind of void, nourished and sustained by practices of glorification. So it's a bit like the idea of God needing prayer to continue to exist, in a sense. But in any case, the second chapter of the dissertation was called Do Prayers Exist in Australia? Which was something that as a native of the predicate, I found kind of amusing. But in 1909, Mauss wasn't talking about Australians generally, but about Indigenous Australians, and most specifically those he called the Arunta people of Central Australia. The source of the material was a book reporting on fieldwork by Spencer and Gillen, written in 1899, The Native Tribes of Central Australia. So Mauss didn't think very highly of the book with its many research deficiencies, but appreciated its marvellous sense of facts. And in fact, while Sir Baldwin Spencer was an Oxford-educated British biologist and ethnologist who settled in Australia, and in fact became a Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University, Francis James Gillen was every bit the colonial, born in the then colony of South Australia. And he became the post and telegraph station master at Alice Springs, that's very much in the centre of Australia, and as a result held two subsidiary or collateral roles. One was special magistrate and the other one was sub-protector of Aborigines. And actually he distinguished himself quite well in the latter role, in both of those roles, by trying to ameliorate the dispersal policy, which was a euphemism for the systematic murder of Aborigines, and charged, but without success, a notorious police constable with Aboriginal homicide. So one suspects that it was Gillen who was actually closest to being fully initiated in the rights of the Arunta, as Mauss puts it. So in these positions then, Gillen was responsible for both the administration of the juridical order of sovereignty in the interior of the Antipodean continent and the mundane government of the indigenous population. So he's concerned with both sovereignty and governing, which is really my theme tonight. And it was through the latter that he would lead Mauss to the conclusion that despite its simplicity, even its crudeness, the Australians did indeed have prayer. Perhaps even more extraordinary for my project is that the Arunta people, through the colonial Gillen, via Spencer and Mauss, and Mauss's uncle and colleague Emil Durkheim, will lead Agamben to what he regards as a central mystery of the very power Gillen was in charge of administering in the then British colony of South Australia. That mystery is, according to Agamben, why does power need glory? If it is essentially force and capacity for action and government, why does it assume the rigid protocol, the cumbersome and glorious form of ceremonies, acclamations and protocols? What is the relation between economy and glory? And the answer has something to do, at least for Agamben, with publicness, with publicity, and with public opinion, and the latter's role as what Carl Schmitt called the modern form of acclamation, that is public opinion. So it seems to me that this question is very different from most of the kind of questions that we've asked about power. Most of those questions concern the question of power over, or the way that A might influence B. And it's also, as I'll show, I think very different from the kind of Foucauldian narrative about power as well. So what I wanted to do, and I wanted to have some sort of fun in doing this, and was try to revisit power as an empirical tool and as a conceptual structure, as having rational and non-rational aspects, as being an immanent domain of forces, but also a transcendent order. So I'm starting with the hypothesis that power is actually something of a mystery. That it's not only about rationalities and technologies, it's about mythologies, symbols and gestures, and ceremonies. Forms of power, especially sovereign power, are associated with this kind of ceremonial aspect, even in our societies, even in constitutional monarchies or republican societies. So just getting to that first slide there. So in order to take this kind of journey, in order to make it a kind of adventure, I gave myself a passport, and the passport is the idea of the signature. That the concept of power, it seems to me, carries a kind of mark, carries an excess. And that excess is simply that no matter what kind of idea of power you think about, if it's soft power in relationship to hard power, that if it's power to do something versus power over, whether it's power as a capacity versus legitimate power, that power exists in this kind of reversible and bipolar field. That it's not possible to think about a concept of power that doesn't have a kind of opposite. And often those opposites are collapsed. So power over and power to are both versions of power as capacity. And that can be then juxtaposed to a kind of juridical conception of power as right or legitimate power. So I think, having surveyed a few of those, and this is in a way was the least interesting part, but was in a sense the kind of key to thinking about power. I think that the central form of this kind of antinomy today is really between a juridical, institutional conception of power associated with the state and state sovereignty, and an economic, managerial one concerned with governance and government. So the term signature I've kind of lifted from Agamben, but I've taken Occam's razor to it. So I've really just reduced it into something that's quite quite basic. Simply that the concept of power always refers us to this determinate but mobile field of interpretive and pragmatic relations, which is very difficult to evade or escape. So mainly, most of our problems with the concept of power is that we spend time trying to get rid of one of these aspects of it. We try to go beyond it. We try to reduce it to a particular pole. That to engage with and use the concept of power, we need to recognise this signature, understand how it operates and the forms it takes, and mobilise it in our analysis. So you'll note I use the word signature as in the singular. I'm trying to, if you like, make this as simple and in a way as falsifiable and as challengeable as possible. Right. And the third claim is that any analytics of power, any kind of analysis of power, if you like, cannot be accomplished without this, because the signature of power is integral to how we think about, exercise, experience and contest power relations. So that's the kind of basic, almost methodological claim. That was the kind of principle of reading. And while there's a lot of kind of narrative and there's a lot of digression in what I try to do in 90,000 or 100,000 words, really the scaffolding is my engagement with three thinkers, Foucault, Schmidt and Agamben, the ones that I've mentioned. So I'll start with Foucault. And it seems to me that Foucault is someone who might be the emblem of how we think about power today, even those people who don't refer to Foucault. So discussions of governance, that we somehow move to a world of governance. We move away from the world of states to one of global civil society. We move to kind of flatter structures, less hierarchical structures. That it seems to me that Foucault attempts an escape from what I call the shadow of the sovereign, or in his own terms, he seeks to cut off the king's head in political thought. Now I'm going to try to replace this cutting off phrase with another phrase, which will so I'll get you to, when I introduce it, I'll tell you, this is the kind of thing you should follow through the rest of the lecture. Okay, so he basically has a narrative of the decline of sovereignty. And his work is a kind of progressive search for a new form of power that is somehow going to displace sovereignty. So he first comes up with discipline, and then discipline's not doing the work. He comes up with biopower. Biopower doesn't do the work. He's looking for this new. Now, so almost an alternative title to this would have been The New Power, but there's a kind of irony you'll see in this idea of the new. You're always looking for the new in that sense. And then in the work on governmentality, he sort of tries to make this rather than a new power, he makes the transition away from sovereignty into the critique of the liberal art of government. So it becomes a kind of a particular ethos that's immanent to the historical process, if you like. And finally, he adopts what I call an economic conception. Economic, in a broad sense of the word, in his notion of the dispositive. This is a kind of very local, immanent, sometimes translated as apparatus word. So here he does all the things that good postmodernists will always do, and good contemporary theorists will always do, that I'm going to reject. These dispositives are all about heterogeneity over homogeneity. They're all about contingency over necessity and singularity over universality. But in a sense, he reproduces the signature of power in all of those kind of methodological choices. There's another version of the same signature. So Foucault is this guy who inaugurates what I would provocatively call our political immanentism. I think we're in a way stuck on the immanent. Right? We're stuck on this kind of economic conception of power. And there are a lot of points in the voyage I could talk about. I could talk about the whole relationship to neoliberalism. And one of the stories I tell is about Francois Revolt and his receiving the Legion of Honour, not for his works of editing Foucault, but for implementing the very neoliberalism Foucault talks about in his lectures. But that's not to say that Foucault's a neoliberal or being co-opted into the neoliberal thought collective. But I'll talk a little bit about the question of security. So I don't know whether I've got a... So one of the things I've... often Foucault's thought of as someone who really sort of initiated a new way of thinking about security. And he juxtaposes here the safety of the prince to the security of the population. So what I mean, this is quite dense, and so I'm not really reproducing it, but what he basically does is anachronistically attributes to Machiavelli and the prince a conception of territorial sovereignty, which would only come much later, and a conception of the state, which didn't exist at that time, as this entity that was separate from rulers and ruled. And both of those, I would say, are singularly important kind of modern innovations that postdate Machiavelli. So Foucault gets that wrong. When he looks at the notion of the population, he also gets that wrong because he forgets about Malthus and Malthus's contribution to the notion of population. So population, security becomes something to do with the regularities of the population, but he kind of forgets what he did know at one stage about population, that with Malthus, and Malthus's formula, which is about the inevitability of the rate of population to outstrip the rate of the means of its subsistence, he kind of neglects the economic catastrophe at the heart of liberal governing. So one of the things I argue against Foucault is liberal governing is not about something, not about the harmonization of interests through this invisible hand, but it's about a kind of response to a particular kind of providential order which has catastrophe at its very heart. And in a way, biocatastrophe at its very heart. So what Foucault becomes for me, someone who's not really giving us a kind of sociological typology of different forms of power, but rather someone who's got a specific philosophical aim, which is to unveil a kind of telos, a telos towards the minimization of domination, maximization of autonomy and difference. And at the end of his lectures on governmentality, he actually thinks he's found it in a very strange place, which is and this is kind of contrary to the view of Foucault being a raving radical or something. He finds it in the writings of the American Chicago school of neoliberalism. And now I'm coming to the phrase I was going to talk to you about. So at one point he says, the more I spoke about population, the more I stopped saying sovereignty. The modern political problem, the privilege that government begins to exercise in relation to rules, to the extent that, to limit the king's power, it will be possible one day to say, the king reigns, but he does not govern. So I think that Foucault stumbles on a kind of epigram there that's at the very heart of trying to grasp what power is. Except he completely misunderstands it because he reads it as a version of cutting the king's head off. So he can't get to the mystery, the arcana of power, and that's sort of the game I'm trying to play here. Okay, so I'll let you know in advance that I think all three thinkers fail. So it's not that, and their failures are productive and interesting. So it's not that I'm dismissing them. So Foucault fled from the shadow of the sovereign. Carl Schmitt felt its presence throughout his life. In fact, in a poem on his 60th birthday, he claimed to have been in the belly of the Leviathan 3 times. After the coup against the SA in 1934, after being denounced by the SS in 1936 and after being interned and interrogated by the Russian and American occupying forces at the end of the war, in which he was sure he was going to be hung. But despite the kind of political and intellectual compromises in the 1930s and the repugnant nature of them, Schmidt has been resurrected in recent years. So I think of him as a contemporary thinker, in the last 10, 15 years, particularly into relations to problems that this search for the new power could never address. The states of emergency, state of exception, particularly after the events of 9/11, new forms of war and conflict, new rules of torture, extrajudicial killing by states, all of this, say, since the time of the War on Terror. I mean, he was already gathering some kind of momentum before that in English-speaking countries, but I think that's really pushed it along. So one of the things that I argue that he does allow us to do is to look at sovereignty as a limited set of competences based on the ability to decide and act upon a condition of danger to what Schmidt calls public order and security, that is to act on the exception. Right? So, one of the themes I argue is that sovereignty is not simply the glorious, splendid form that's ceremoniously imagined, if you like, but it is a set of particular competences based on this ability to decide when public order and security are in danger. So Jeffrey Bussolini has called Schmidt's focus as a focus on ongoing foundational events or acts, such as the sovereign decision, the jus belli or war declaration, appropriation as a condition of any social, political, or legal order, or the nomos. And so that these acts have a kind of continuing eminence, no matter how submerged under the normal functioning of economic and governmental management. So no matter how much we would want to talk, say in the case of Australia, about forms of new economic management, new governmental management, from a Schmittian position, the kind of act of land appropriation of the Australian continent by Britain is an ongoing component in the kind of structure of those power relations. So security is linked in a very kind of fundamental way in Schmidt to questions of sovereignty and its basic competence. So it's not a matter, so unlike Foucault, it's not for him a matter of academic knowledge or technical expertise, but is always a political decision. While it is appropriate to establish the empirical existence and transformation of different security rationalities, with Foucault, this move cannot avoid sovereignty as the structure of decisions that defines the threshold at which public order and security obtain, what their content is, and how in any given situation that might be achieved. Okay, so I want to mention three sets of relationships just to sort of about Schmidt. The first one is his relationship with Max Weber. And Jürgen Habermas found himself getting into trouble at one point by calling him Weber's legitimate student, and he had to amend it to Weber's natural son. In his early writings, we're talking about early 1920s, Schmidt tries to complete Weber's thesis on secularization. So alongside the idea of the kind of Protestant ethic and the economic rationalization in the formation of capitalism, Schmidt emphasizes the role of the canon law of the Catholic Church in the formation of the modern state. So there's a kind of political rationalization coming out of Catholicism that complements, and is in fact a condition for Weber's economic rationalization. So while Weber diagnoses modernity as a kind of condition of loss of spiritual bearings in a world without transcendence. Schmitt is one of the continuation of confessional civil war by other means. So the second debate is one that comes along. So what I was doing with this book was playing with the kind of ideas that you could go up avenues that didn't sound like they were necessarily directly about power. And you would find something new to say about power in that. And the second one is the debates that Schmitt had in the 1960s on secularization. And there's a lot in those debates, but and mainly with Hans Blumenberg. But the one thing that I wanted to draw out of them was that Schmitt opposes Blumenberg's self-assertion of humans in modernity. And he sees it as a kind of aggressiveness, aggressivity of the new, which cannot abolish the political because it declares war on the old. So Schmitt defines the political in terms of friend-enemy relationship. But so in the assertion of the new, which Blumenberg in a sense is claiming has a kind of legitimacy of its own, that simply that it is new. Schmitt's answer that this then has this kind of aggressiveness towards the old, towards tradition, towards authority, and so on as the enemy. And the very last words he'll ever put in a book are those ones there, Stat pro ratione libertas e novitas pro libertate. Freedom replaces reason, novelty replaces freedom. And I guess I found that there's something there that suggests a kind of link between this search for a new power, this kind of idea of of the newness of something having its own legitimacy, simply because it is another kind of innovation of human beings in their response to dealing with their problems and so on. So I found this kind of an interesting way of thinking about that philosophical search for the new, for the emergent new, that I've characterized Foucault as doing. And the third relationship, which I won't talk about too much, is the relationship between Schmitt and neoliberalism, because it's really quite suppressed. And Hayek at the end of his life actually comes out and has to admit that he's kind of derived his whole rule of law notion from Schmitt, and his attack on Weimar legal positivism and welfare state interventionism. So I'll come back to that, because one of the things that I found really interesting in thinking about this whole question of power was the notion of order. And as you say, ordo-liberalism, this German neoliberal movement from the 1930s, was one of the key sources of neoliberalism, is focused on this idea of order. And I haven't seen a lot of commentary on the very notion of order that appears there. Okay, so the other great thing about the price of admission into Schmitt's work is that he also deals with these kings, the king reigns, but he does not govern phrase. And he asks through another guy, what becomes of the regna if one removes the gouverner? What becomes of the reign if one removes the governing? And Schmitt's answer is authority, understood as resting on an element of continuity and referring to tradition and duration. So, and he distinguishes that from every other form of power, including sovereignty itself. Right? So this is this kind of effective power and authority is another version of the signature that I've been pushing. What have I put there? Sovereignty marked as the foundational transcendent access of power, nonetheless can be approached. So, in a way, Foucault wants to go on this search for the immanent, if he wants to go on this search for the kind of reduction of power, this flattening of power, this taking away of the sovereign, cutting off the king's head, Schmitt is all the time trying to restore it. He's trying to restore the ongoing foundation. He's trying to say there's authority, there's a more fundamental legitimation than legality, there's these acts of appropriation, which he calls the nomos, if you like. These are the ongoing foundation. So he's asserting this kind of sovereignty, or this sovereign axis of power, if you like, marked as the foundational transcendent one. So in the course of, so between Foucault and Schmitt, I've got the economic governmental axis that Foucault sees power as somehow trending towards, and this other axis of sovereign reign. So I'm thinking that they are the two kind of key ways of thinking about power. That's the two characterizations of this signature of power. But the one thing that I'll emphasize, or the one positive takeaway thing in the sense of Schmitt, is that while sovereignty and law are marked as this kind of transcendent foundation, transcendent simply meaning something like separate and autonomous. So if immanent means a set of dependent relations, a network of dependent relations, transcendent simply means a separate and autonomous sphere. Okay? Nothing particularly mysterious about that. So while sovereignty and law are marked as this kind of transcendent foundation, the Constitution and so on, they can nonetheless be approached as an immanent set of practices and competencies. Okay, so I've got through two of them, and we go to the stuff where the theology comes in. Giorgio Agamben, and I'm talking really only about his most recent work. There's been so much commentary on Homo Sacer and all of that, I think I'm dispensing with that. And so he's trying to say that he also comes closest, in a sense, to getting this signature. And he wishes to demonstrate that Christian theology begets these two paradigms there. Political theology, which founds, and I'm quoting, which founds the transcendence of sovereign power on a single God, and economic theology, which replaces this transcendence with the idea of an oikonomia conceived as an immanent ordering of both divine and human life. And political philosophy and the theory of sovereignty derive from political theology, according to him, and modern biopolitics and liberal economic government derive from economic theology. So we're not there yet, so go back. Yeah, so to sort of place it in terms of what I've been saying, you could say that there's a kind of, Weber concludes that modern capitalism is a result of the economic rationalization of the Protestant ethic. Schmitt views modern law in the state as a political rationalization of Catholic canon law. And Foucault, by the way, views modern expertise as a secularization of the Catholic pastorate. Agamben proposes that political economy is a social rationalization of the providential oikonomia, of the divine economy. And the divine economy is something that he traces back, linked to a kind of explanation by early Christians of the Holy Trinity, of the triune God as a way beyond Judaic and pagan monotheism and Gnostic dualism. So economy is really interesting, and that's very significant to what Agamben's story is. I mean, one of the things that it tells us is that the economy is not a kind of sphere that's separate from power, that the notions of economy and the notions of economic management are a part of this whole signature of power that I'm talking about. And one of the fascinating kind of footnotes to that is part of the genealogy of this notion of oikonomia is Cicero's Latin translation of oikonomia as dispositio, a dispositive of power, and an economy of power thus become equivalent. So Foucault often uses that word economy of power, and you can see the kind of etymological origins of that notion there. What I'm more interested in was an idea of order. And not so much what Agamben says about order, but what was happening amongst theologians, jurists, and economists in the 1930s in Germany with this notion of order, because all of them were referring back to medieval conceptions of order. And I think if you reflect for a moment, when we're talking about power, we're often use this word order quite a lot. And it's a very polyvalent term, but it's also a term that allows us to articulate, economic order and political order, domestic order and international order. It rolls off the tongue. It does a lot of work for us. And this is what fascinated me, that these guys actually derived this conception from Thomas Aquinas, medieval scholasticism, and so on. So in a 1941 dissertation, Herman Krings showed that God can only be known or inferred through the order among his creatures, which is an order that God has created through his praxis, through his activity of finishing, forming, and ordering. So that's kind of interesting because it's saying, that we don't have direct access to the divine. We can only know the divine by the order of creaturely existence. But what's more interesting is that at the same time, and making the same kind of references, both in law and in economics, we find a parallel. That in law, Schmidt shows that law, its norms and conceptions of justice already depend on the establishment of a concrete order. So law is not primarily about universal set of values. It's about the interpretation and implementation of what might present themselves as universal set of values only after a concrete order, that is a concrete institutional framework, has been established. And that depends on, in Schmidt's case, on acts of appropriation, land appropriation. But even more amazing than that, and to me, thinking also about neoliberalism, our contemporary moment, is that Walter Eucken and his colleagues published their Ordo Manifesto in economics only 2 years after Schmidt had come up with that formulation. And by doing so, they tried to move the market. They said the market's not natural. The market is something that is unveiled by proper economic and social policies and a proper legal framework. So they sought to move the market from nature to an artifact of economic order. So they sought to defeat what they saw was the pantheistic theology of classical liberalism or early liberalism, with without going into the kind of monotheism of state intervention. They sought to defeat that by this concept of order. So anyway, I think I probably said enough about order. The kind of easiest way to think about it is that Krings says, being is ordo and the ordo is being. The ordo does not presuppose any being, but being has the ordo as its condition of possibility. So when it's only in the implementation of the particular praxis, particular set of practices of economic management, for example, that the market comes into existence. Okay, so the last bit of Gambon, I'm not quite yet getting to the conclusion, is on providence. I'll just, without going into any of the details, this to me is also a very helpful notion in thinking about liberal ways of governing. So providence is a general order, say the divine order, maybe manifest in the laws of physics or thermodynamics. And fate is contrasted to fate as its accidental effect, being killed by a lightning strike. So Gambon comes up with the phrase that between providence and fate is a collateral effect that is calculated. Now that might be any kind of calculation, any kind of risk management, any kind of anticipatory, precautionary logic against catastrophe. Okay. And then this is a quote, and we're coming back again to that phrase that I kept kind of as a touchstone in trying to work through this stuff. The God that reigns yet does not govern thus makes possible the government. In other words, government is an epiphenomenon of providence. So that's actually working the relationship the other way. The market order, or the Malthusian population thesis, is a providential order that, as a result of fate, leads to various catastrophes. that then needs a particular form of government. So, Malthus, who I've got a thing about, I guess, because I wrote about him in my dissertation, has this idea that providential order necessitates a particular kind of not only domestic, but colonial government and administration. So a particular view of life, a particular kind of organisation of life, if you wanted to write this in biopolitical terms, is one in which life is about this constant struggle to produce the means of subsistence against the growth of population, is linked to a particular bioeconomic order of life and concrete forms of life. So he's very influential over the Poor Laws, of course, in England, but he was actually wrote quite a lot about the savage life of the natives in the colonies, and wrote about the administration, and not only wrote about, taught colonial administration in a chair that was funded by the East India Company. So that's quite interesting. Another one of those like little interesting stories. Okay, so Agamben comes closest to grasping this kind of signature through theology, through economic theology, through these notions of order, through this notion of providence. I give a lot of examples of contemporary kind of neoliberal versions of the use of catastrophe as the moment of intervention, as the moment of the climate change. What's the answer to that? Create carbon markets, or create a miracle, the wonders of some kind of geoengineering that's going to be the solution, right? So the catastrophe is this kind of, I want to maintain this catastrophic event, often this bio-catastrophic event, is actually the kind of hidden hand of liberal governing. So Agamben comes closest to this kind of understanding the signature, and this understanding this little phrase, the king reigns but he does not govern. Because even in that notion of order, you see that there is still this transcendent thing that's being unveiled. There is still this divine order that's being unveiled. There's still the sovereign there. If it's but it's only knowable through our praxis, our proper praxis, our proper actions in the world, our proper way of governing. So he comes closest to realising this. Now, there are a number of problems with it. I want to focus just on one, but one that's very much will also is very instructive, and will take us back to this idea of glory as well. That he talks about, so he comes up with the idea then that power is caught between something like this sovereignty and this sovereign reign side of things and this economic governmental one. But then he starts using the term machine, and machine seems to me does a strange work there. It moves his analysis out of the analytic, which is really my concern. I'm not primarily concerned with the normative conception of power, although that distinction itself, again, is another kind of part of this very same phenomenon I'm talking about. But it allows him to move what is an analytical insight into a normative one. So since Hobbes, when anyone's talked about power as a machine, it's either been in awe of power, of the workings of power, or it's been as a kind of monster, an automaton that we need to reject. So at Agamben's aim, and I don't quite understand the political kind of rationale or at least genealogy of this, is to render the machine inoperative. He wants to stop the machine from working. But the idea of inoperativity fulfills another function. And I'm quoting him when he says, man is a sabbatical animal, which is kind of an attractive idea for academics anyway. Only by reflecting on her own inoperativity can man open herself to the political. So in dialogue, what I don't really have time to in a way summarise is that in dialogue with theologians, particularly Eric Peterson, and his work the Book of Angels, so you're not going to get my take on angels just yet. Agamben spends much time examining practices of glorification in both religious liturgy and political acclamation. And so some of the most interesting passages is the interchange between the analysis of Christian liturgy and songs of praise and laudes in the medieval church and modern practices of acclamation. Now, again, in Germany, this is happening during a period of fascism and so on, so that there's a kind of, in fact, there's a kind of intertwined history of the revival of these acclamations in the Catholic Church and the revival of acclamations in the public squares of Europe at the same time in authoritarian dictatorships, fascist dictatorships. But Agamben wants to go further, and he wants to say that with Schmidt, that the modern form of political acclamation is public opinion, and that we may not have the kind of direct mass salutations of fascist regimes, but we have the mediatized ones of putatively deliberative liberal democracies, and that they are equally necessary to the nourishment of sovereignty and the nourishment of the void at its centre. So Agamben suggests a project which he calls a political archaeology of glory, which I think is quite a kind of nice idea. It's the idea of, you know, the different ways in which sovereignty is glorified, the different forms of glorification, the different thresholds by which public opinion, by something that can become public opinion, attain publicity, can act in this sort of acclamatory way. And of course, our phrase comes up again. So he tries to answer the question, what remains of the reign when one removes the governing? And Agamben answers in a very kind of deconstructive, I think, way, the remainder that poses itself as the whole that subtracts from itself. Now, that would take me a long time to sit around thinking about what that actually means. But he does see this glory as a part of the stitching together of these two sides of power, of the sovereign reign side, of the economic management side, the transcendent and the immanent side. But, and I'm quite happy to continue that idea of a political archaeology of glory, but I want to say, in response to the political side of Agamben, why should we wish to render all government inoperative rather than seeking to engage with the different ways we are being governed? And are not the very bureaucracies Agamben would have us deactivate among the very means of limiting the kind of providential order of the economy or the global economy or the divine economy? So in my view, we should approach sovereignty as both a site of practices of glorification and a set of limited competences, of immanent competences, if you like, involving security and public order. The decision on the exception, the declaration of war, the making and enforcing of law, and the power to levy and collect taxes would be some of those competencies. So we need an archaeology of glory and, in a sense, an analytics of sovereignty. So before I move, I'm just going to move on briefly to try to point out where this leaves us in terms of the study of power. So one conclusion is that the three principal characters have failed, but they've taught us a lot in doing so. Right. And they've failed not in their recognition of the signature of power, they've all recognised it, but in their desire to somehow go beyond it. So at the very moment of failure, they return to the simplest model of power as domination. Foucault, at the end of his life, would seek an ethical solution to minimise domination. Agamben, having assembled the operations of the bipolar field of power, would seek a politics to render the providential machine inoperative, thus juxtaposing an absolute domination to messianic resistance. And Schmidt, as state law theorist, could not envisage another side of power relatively autonomous from its ongoing foundation in appropriation, the system of property and distribution thus established, and the nomos or concrete order that secures it. So they all sort of revert to this kind of fairly stereotypical, in a way, conception of power, despite the kind of insights that you get through the voyage of going through them. So my point is not to really stand around criticising these three important thinkers, but to try to move on to something that I think, sketch where I think that leaves us as far as power is concerned. And I'm going to say a few words about that. There's not all of my conclusions. And the first one is simply that the signature of power must be maintained. So the only way we can think about power is to continue with that idea of the signature. That the analysis of the exercise of or relations of power must seek to articulate sovereign reign and economic governmental axes of power without reducing them to one another. I'll just say some words about sovereignty and then about government or governmentality. The analysis of sovereignty must proceed, I think, along two axes. I think I've already made those points. That it's marked as a kind of ideal transcendent pole, but it also can be approached as a material, immanent practice or set of competences that I've talked about. So in that sense, I suggest a political archaeology of glory meets an analytic of sovereign practices. Now, just with the glory side of things, I think this is where the notion of publics really comes into it, because it's about the way in which forms of glorification constitute publics. That's what it has as its heart. The songs of praise and church liturgy constitute the Christian church. The Nazi and fascist acclamations constitute the direct presence of the public character of the nation or the Volk. And so today, opinion polls, television ratings, box office receipts, website traffic, numbers of personal followers on social media sites come to constitute or substitute for public opinion as a kind of modern form of acclamation. And so I want a kind of analysis of that in terms of the thresholds at which these, in a way, fully privatised public, how this mass of privatised opinions achieves publicness or publicity, comes to be obvious, taken for granted, and an unchallenged presence that can present itself as public opinion. So one of the projects I talk about is an analytics of publicity or publicness, not publicity in that sense. On the other side of things, looking at sovereignty as a set of competences, one of the starting points that I would take with an analysis of sovereignty is that it is always a vicarious power. It's always a delegated power. It's always delegated onto particular agents. And so I've talked before, and I explore the idea of the different ways in which you divide and add up sovereignty in forms of delegation, arrogation, and derogation. What are the spaces in which sovereignty can leave, can withdraw, can annul itself? If sovereignty concerns the monopoly of the claim for the monopoly of violence, as Max Weber would say, then how do we explain what happens on sporting fields? There's a withdrawal at that point, an abrogation of sovereignty. Similarly, with the kind of special economic zone, there's a kind of abrogation of certain kinds of sovereign practices around taxation and so on. So, and on the other side, the governmental side, I think we have to rethink that. We have to be able to free ourselves from the liberal critique of sovereignty. The idea that we must limit sovereignty, that the art of government is about a limiting of sovereignty, because liberal problematizations takes this doxology, this glorification of sovereignty at face value, as rendering it as something that's all-powerful and all-knowing. So I argue that we shouldn't be conflating the symbols, mythologies, and acclamations for the immanent and limited set of competencies and practices of sovereignty, and the ones that I've talked about before, and the way those competencies are delegated or arrogated. You know, they're brought together, or they're delegated or devolved onto certain kind of actors and agents. So I talk about the necessity for a historical sociology of sovereignty and law alongside a genealogy of government. But the other side is while government is also marked as an immanent thing, this is the immanent side of power, it has this kind of transcendent dimension. You know, in providential forms of government, it invokes a divine order, which might include the divine economy. In liberal forms of government, it is the order of the market, or of competition, or the global economy. In executive government, it is the constitutive power, the constitution, that gives rise to a concrete juridical order. In public policy, it could be the taxpayer, or indeed the public, or public opinion. So the immanent axis, that is the practice, the practical axis, appears as a secondary to, an outgrowth of this transcendent order. And there's a certain, I could go into the role of the event in that as well, but I just want to point out that government doesn't, you know, this is one other reason we should get rid of this kind of narrative of the becoming immanent of sovereignty, of this kind of transformation of power. One thought on the problem, something relevant to the problem of security and publics, and while having mentioned both and not brought them together, I would say that they each suggest something of the two sides of sovereign power. Its glorious transcendent side, in which publicness, publicity, and the public is a condition for the nourishment and continued sustenance of sovereignty, and also the immanent practice of sovereignty. So security is a basic competence of an immanent practice of sovereignty. So we can analyse the governmental rationalities and technologies of security, or the mass and virtue of acclamation, but this conjunction of security and public seems to me to take us to the very heart of the double exercise of political power. Okay, so the king reigns but does not govern strikes me as a very good epigram for the signature, which refers power to both a field of economic management marked as immanent and the glorious splendour of the often absent or hidden, sometimes neutral sovereign reign, marked as transcendent. As magistrate and as postmaster and protector of Aborigines, Gillen helped bring this exact field of power to Central Australia. And by a strange reversal, his Aboriginal people gave back to him and us something of the mystery of this very same kind of power. Thank you.